just want to try to get going, so we have lots of time to do things. So thank you so much for coming this morning. I always say you have many choices, like they say on the airlines, and you chose to be here, so I'm grateful for it. So I want to start out talking about the current landscape of higher education, which is no surprise to any of you, right? All of these things that I'm going to say, that education, we all teach, and we're in a context of this atmosphere that places a greater value on achievement than actually on learning. That we have standardized tests and assessments that suck the life out of learning and incentivize cheating, especially in K through 12 systems. And we inherit these students that are used to this kind of thing, and we replicate this madness in our own classrooms. Surveillance systems now that track, monitor, punish, and insist on compliance. Like, what the heck are we doing here? We think of schoolwork as transactional exchange, a product for a grade. And we've taught our students this too. And then we teach our students that the only currency of value for the work that you're doing is your grade. And then we turn around and call them grade grubbers when they want those 2 points. Like, why are we surprised by that, right? Like, we set our students up, we train them in this system, and this kind of transactional education is where we are. Not surprisingly, this is highly competitive, it's stressful, the mental health crisis is at an all-time high. High student loan debt from decades of state and federal defunding. Public viewing college primarily as a private benefit. I don't want to fund that, that's just about you and your kid and them getting a job and getting somewhere. We don't see the public value of public education anymore. And so we were like, well, how do we get here? Well, John Warner has this wonderful book where he talks about, since the early 1980s, this ethos of privatization and competition turned students into consumers and colleges into businesses, right? Since the Reagan era. And I encourage you to read his book. This move from public to private has been really destructive. And then even another really important book called The Fantasy Economy. I encourage you all to put this on your reading list. Like, this economic situation that we're in was actually a deliberate project to shift the responsibility for economic precarity and inequality away from industry and policy, right? And put it squarely on the shoulders of educators and schools. Like, if we don't have enough educated people for the workforce, it's your fault. Well, we're going to defund you and expect you to produce workers and then say it's your fault that we don't have workers. And it's this madness that we all have to sort of be thinking about this context. So definitely read this and then try to sleep at night. But also it's about how can we be more aware of what's going on in terms of our society and the way that higher education is being blamed for so many things that are actually not our fault. And like, do more with less, like, that's just, I'll try not to use profanity. Yeah.
Well, we have access to your slides.
Yes, my last slide is a bit.ly link to the slide deck.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't do it ahead of time because then people are looking ahead on the slide. So in terms of science education, we've also create this very competitive kind of atmosphere, right? We have these extreme models of competition, and we think about, like, well, what is it that we're doing here? Is our goal to really create more students to fit into this monoculture? So when we talk about science education reform, we need to do better. Let's use open science tools. Is that just about getting more students to fit into this monoculture so they can be just like us? And so we can replicate this workforce that can go out and replicate the society that we're living in? Is there anything that's really transformative about that, just because you're better at educating more students to do the same thing? I want us to really think differently about how we can think about science education reform in a context of, yeah, open science, yes, but open science is not a panacea by itself, right? The morals and values that we act within it are incredibly important. And that's where I think open education, which is also no panacea, but intersecting the way that we think about what does it mean to do open pedagogy, which I'm going to talk more about, and then put our science education reform or transformation that we want to be doing in this context. And this is the kind of intersection that I want to talk about today and get you thinking about working on some stuff, because I swear I won't talk the whole time. Davida talked a lot about the National Center for Science and Civic Engagement, which is a great step forward, right? People thinking about what is the purpose of our science education. And there have been these reform movements. Kyle in 2020 wrote this great article where he talks a lot about, science education, not just like a side project to help students do something that's relevant, but the very essence of what you're doing in your classroom is about thinking about sustainability and social transformation. Like, that's why we're there. And he talks about how youth are demanding action, right? And science educators ought to enable learners and communities to transform and reinvent the world they're inheriting, right? Our students represent that next generation of scientists. Like, what does it really mean to prepare that next generation? A lot of people use that catchphrase, but really, what are we talking about when we say that? And so connecting how we're using open science, using open data tools, helping more students be successful. How are we connecting that to the idea of the fact that science education itself can be part of the problem if it's not actually working towards change and getting students to change how they think about the purpose of their science education and what they're going to do after they graduate. So we need to link what we're doing in open science with other science reform movements, like the decolonizing science education movement. Like, there are people out there thinking very differently about the purpose of science. And in this paper, Cato et al. Argue that mainstream science education is contaminated by neoliberal values and functions in the service of political domination and exploitation, and that a neoliberal and exploitative science education does not contribute to the building of a just and sustainable world. This is a really big thing to say. Like, what are we teaching our students? How are we teaching our students? And again, I'm not here to provide answers. I'm here to be provocative, to provoke you to think differently about what are you teaching, why are you teaching it, how are you contextualizing it? And even if it's math, and even if it's abstract, there are ways that we connect to the ideas of the ways in which we want our students to think differently in terms of their science education. And so, yeah, we're all here because we embrace these values of open science. Some of the other speakers talk broadly about open science, citizen science, open source. But this is a pretty complicated set of stuff of interconnected pieces. Like, how many of us actually teach all of this when we're doing open science? Like, if you're just using open data, and you may put a slide up like this and say it's part of a bigger world, but how much is this being integrated throughout your entire class or your curriculum? How are we thinking about how this is broadly part of what we're doing in open science? How can we actually create assignments and things for students to think about these different pieces, not just open data, but open notebooks and open access publication and open sharing? And so we often purport that there's all these amazing benefits to open science, right? You've seen lots of slides like this. UNESCO has these slides. Okay, but let's consider this range of benefits. Like, how much of this is actually happening in the world? How many people are really doing it? What's the predominant way that science is being done today? Right? In spite of the fact that this has been, all these great things are societal benefits and trust and integrity and advocacy and community outreach. The proportion of people actually doing science openly that hits all these benefits is very, very low still. Right? And so how are we teaching our students about these benefits? One great assignment is to say, hey, do some research, pick a few benefits and see if you can find examples of where that's actually happening. And compare that to the proportion of research that's done otherwise. And let's see how much open science is actually happening in this broad scope framework. That's one of the kinds of assignments I want you to be thinking about developing. And so again, this idea, if open science is so great, why isn't anybody doing it? Why isn't anybody doing it? And so it kind of goes back to that, like, who does science benefit? Right? So you'll hear reasons like lack of incentives for promotion and tenure. Okay? So who creates promotion and tenure guidelines? Right? Again, these are not handed down from God. We have to create pressure on committees that create promotion and tenure guidelines for things to shift. We have to shift systemic structures. And people are like, yes, that's hard. It's really hard and it's really long. And I'm like, yes, and you have to do it anyway. Because we have to. We really, don't have any choice anymore. Like, higher education's under siege, if you haven't realized that already. It has been actually for a while, and particularly it's really ramping up. So there's pressure for publication quantity. Like, put out a lot of papers, especially in prestigious journals, many of whom are not open access, right? Why would you, if your career is centered around this, why are you going to be doing open science? Disinterest in negative and replicative results, been forever, because you're trying to publish. Awards for individual scientific superstars, right? Open science is about collaboration and sharing and global good, and yet we award superstars, and we try to tell our students, go out there and do better and be a superstar. This is not actually very helpful. Fear of being scooped, because sharing is not the thing. It's if your data gets stolen, it's a problem, and it's a real problem. Concerns about standards. Oh, that data is not good enough. It hasn't been vetted. The RIB process. So, as Nosek wrote in 2012, what's good for science is not always good for the scientist's career. Okay, and the focus on open science, trying to have a broad open science movement, has been broadly pitched at established scientists who are already quite successful in science and already keep these trends going. And so I'm really arguing today for what we really need is a cultural shift, right? So on top of all that, open science can actually exacerbate current systemic inequities, right? There's this idea of cumulative advantage. If you're already successful, you're more likely to receive recognition and rewards if you put your stuff out there. Notice some top scientists are not afraid to share their data because everybody knows it's from their lab, okay? But if you're a vulnerable person, perhaps a marginalized scholar of color in some corner, and somebody takes your data, who's going to protect you? This abuse of women and scholars of color is a real thing. Vulnerability of sharing not good enough data by those that aren't already established. Open data can be used to invade privacy, take away rights, oppress others. So I'm not arguing that we should, let's not do open science. I'm saying what we need to do is build structures, especially within our educational systems, to allow us to address these inequities. Open data can jeopardize data sovereignty, especially indigenous data. And so, and not just humans, but the vulnerability of protected species and putting everything out there. Everybody's going to go there, sort of like the tourism industry. Everybody's going to Barcelona. Now they're squirting tourists with squirt. Like, it's the same kind of thing. If the openness is not a panacea. And so to really think about transforming scientific practice that is truly open, not just open, but equitable, socially just, in service of the global public, does require a shift, right? A cultural shift. And where do cultural shifts happen? You know, influencing the minds of the young people in our classrooms. And so we need undergraduate open science curricula that are comprehensive, not just about open data, not just about a couple of things. They're comprehensive, that whole scope of open science, and emphasize the values of doing science openly. And we can't say, I'm just a science educator, I don't have to think about all that other stuff, because actually you do. And I'm sorry, but you do. And this is where open pedagogy can be really powerful, because you're like, oh, how am I going to do all that? You know, I got so much on my shoulders already. And I understand that. I'm not trying to pressure people that already feel like you're in pretty precarious positions. But those that do have privilege need to spend some time and energy leveraging that privilege. And those that are in more vulnerable positions can find people even outside of other institutions to get together to be talking about this, because we really are running out of time. So let me talk a little bit more about open pedagogy. So how many of you are all familiar with the Creative Commons licenses and the 5R permissions? And a lot of this is about like creating materials that you can reuse, revise, remix. And David Wiley, who was an early mover and shaker in the open ed movement, defined open pedagogy as that set of teaching and learning practices only possible in the context of the free access and 5R permissions characteristic of OER. Okay. But the thing is, he actually later revised it. Now he calls this OER-enabled pedagogy because there are a lot of other people that have been doing the kinds of pedagogical practices that we can consider in the context of openness, and have expanded these definitions of open pedagogy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This first one that Robin DeRosa articulated a while ago, this shift of emphasis of student contribution to knowledge as opposed to simple consumption of knowledge, right? Our students as contributors. The ability for learners to shape and take ownership of their own education. A means to connect with a broader global community, as well as a means to challenge and expand existing understandings of student-centered learning, that tired phrase. We're so student-centered here at our college, but are ya? Are you though? Freedom of action and authority, Jim Luke. Potential of openness and sharing to improve learning, as well as a social justice orientation, caring about equity with openness as one way to achieve this. Okay, so I could summarize all of this thinking, and there are others. There are many, many thinkers that have talked about open pedagogy. And for me, this bullet point, learners contributing to, not just consuming knowledge. You know, a lot of in science education, a lot of it is about, let me, open up your skull and pour some facts into it, memorize, spit it out on a test, and you're learning this stuff. I had a student in my biology class who was talking about an organic chemistry test that he had coming up. And he was like, I just can't wait for finals to be over so I can just forget all this stuff. He was like dumping all these facts into his brain so he could spit it out on the test, so he could not wait to forget it all. Is that what learning is? Is that what we're doing? So contributing, not just consuming and perhaps regurgitating, but community and collaboration, sharing resources and ideas, but also power, sharing power in your classroom. Connections to the wider public, working for the public good, for the public to understand what are we doing here and why are we doing it, and how do they actually see the value of it, so that maybe they will put a tax dollar in our direction at some point. And students having agency, driving their learning processes, and those of us as faculty guiding them through this. These, to me, are the salient features of what open pedagogy is about. And it intersects with open science, right? And when I talk about like the open pedagogy of open science, I'm talking about bringing these values and this way of teaching and learning into how we're teaching open science. Okay, so open pedagogy is also often about creating stuff. I give similar talks like this to people that are from a variety of disciplines, not just scientists, even though I was a biology professor for 30 years, by the way. I'm a STEM educator. I was at a public college in New Hampshire, Keene State College, taught there for many, many years. But students, not just using OER like OpenStack's biology textbooks, which is great, save your students money. We saved our students over $200,000 just by swapping out a commercial textbook for a free OER, and I encourage you to do that. But free and open are not the same thing. And having open materials that you can create, things that you can put together like websites, Google Documents, videos, you can put an open license on anything with various permissions, allowing people to share. And so students creating stuff is a big part of this, but we also have to ask the question, why are you creating what you're creating? Who's the audience for it? Who's benefiting from what you're creating, and why? These are important questions that get to the values of open pedagogy and the open philosophy, and why we're thinking about what we're doing and who we're doing it for and what we're trying to achieve. And so some examples of students putting things together, like having websites, just creating something where they have a say over what they want to say and who they want to say it to. So it's really different to say my students put together a website and they put all the data and they put stuff about their class and we all had a very uniform way of doing that. Then to say, here's your slice of the web, do it however you want. What do you have to say? And sharing it with the world, sharing it with classmates, sharing it outside of their classrooms, where openness means beyond the doors of the classroom, beyond the time frame of the semester, so that their work lives on. And that's why we talk about like renewable assignments that aren't just thrown away at the end of the semester. What happens at the end of the semester now, you collect all the assignments, and in the old days they'd be paper and you'd pick them up and throw them in the garbage, all those exams that students didn't pick up. now you just delete them out of the learning management system, like this idea of disposable work. But students doing things that live beyond the end of the semester and have a life. Like this website created in, I think, 2017 is still there, where a student wanted to talk about the impacts on the oceans of spring break. Like what happens when students are down on spring break throwing garbage on the beach, and she just wanted to talk about that to her peers and to others out there. And this still lives. And I know things become dated, and the idea that when students have a slice of their web, some folks have called this a domain of one's own, right? The idea of Virginia Woolf's room of one's own. You have a website, the slice of your own that you can have some control over. This was a student in one of my non-majors biology classes where we were talking about the genetics of skin color, right? I used one of the National Science Case Center things about like how many alleles and polygenic inheritance and skin color. And she decided that she wanted to write about the social construction of race in the context of her own family. And she wrote this post called 50 Shades of Brown. This wasn't an assignment I gave. The assignment was reflect on this, write something about it. What moves you? What do you want to share? What do you want your peers to know? What do you want the world to know? That's the essence of open pedagogical philosophy. And these are like tropical marine biology students that wrote a whole entire textbook. They envisioned it, they authored it, they edited it, and over a couple of different semesters, after the students graduated, 3 or 4 of them still wanted to work on this project, and they did additional editing, and they added pieces to it, and then the next semester the students came and did revision. Like in an ideal world, the stuff that students are creating, it's that process, it's that journey. It's not really about the product, right? OER emphasizes products. Open pedagogy emphasizes processes, because ultimately it's that journey of learning and education where they're figuring out how to create things and what they want to say and what they want to share. And maybe 5 years from now, they'll disagree with themselves. I think that's kind of what we all hope for, is that we learn more and we revise our thinking. So again, I have links to that book if you want to see it. So some people mentioned hypothesis, web annotation. It's a great open pedagogy tool. So you can lock it down in your learning management system and only have the students in your class use it. But the beauty of hypothesis is that you can make it public. You can publicly annotate an article. So you can get the students in your class to annotate it together with the students in somebody else's class on the other side of the country or the world. Like we're going to get all our 200 level ecology students to collectively annotate an article about coral reef biology or whatever and have a conversation outside of the classroom. You can invite anybody into this discussion. You can invite the author of the article into the discussion. And your students, they will not be intimidated. It's interesting, right? So, and I've seen people do things like annotation flash mobs. We're all going to annotate this article on January 10th at 2 p.m. We're all going to get in there and start typing at the same time. And it creates a different kind of atmosphere. So I highly encourage you to use the web version of hypothesis outside of your LMS in a public way that encourages conversation and discussion that you have some control over, because you're also helping to facilitate that conversation with your students. Wikipedia, huge tool for open education. This was a student in Dr. Strassman's behavioral ecology course at Washington University. Maybe some of you know her, pretty famous animal behavior scientist. Having your students writing about butterfly taxonomy, life cycle, habitat behavior. You're getting your work out there. When students do work for an audience that's way beyond just you as a professor, they care about it. They want it to be right. They want it to be interesting. They want it to be useful. I had a student in my class who was working on one of his spaces and he wasn't posting anything. And I said, Doug, we're so many weeks in, why haven't you done any work yet? And it turns out he'd written like 5 things already, just didn't post them yet because he was worried they weren't good enough. Like that feeling of, I want this to be the best it can possibly be, because it's not just for you, Dr. C. Like, who cares what you think? It's like, this is my friends are going to read this, my peers are going to read this, an audience is going to read this. And so when you turn those tables on your students, that they can see the work that they're doing, and in their science classes, they're doing work for a scientific project, and they're connecting it to something going on in their local community, and they're sharing that data and that information with what other people are doing out there. They work because they're motivated to learn, not just because they're going to get a grade. Okay. I can talk more about grades. This Carlos Gallier gave a talk yesterday, students creating open podcasts to serve the public, right? This is where citizen science and open education all come together. You know, talking about antimicrobial resistance in the environment that anybody in the community can listen to. So I want to talk about trust, power, and agency, because a lot of this is about suspending some of our need to control things within the classroom, especially science educators. Like if I don't lock this down, if I don't do it all ahead of time, if I don't figure out all the tools or how that website works or know how to run a Google site or a WordPress site, then we're not going to be able to do this. But, you know, like let your students figure it out together. You know, I'd have my students all bring their laptops and we'd sit down together, and then they'd be like saying, okay, well, I don't know how this works. And I'm like, I don't know how it works either. You show me. And like working collectively. So students can, as I've mentioned, they can create content for sure, but they can also do things like they can write the syllabus with you. I've had co-constructed syllabi with my students. It's really quite fabulous. You're like, but you teach invertebrate zoology. What do they know about that? Well, we have a discussion about it. I say, these are all the things that we could learn. These are things I've done in the past. What can you find? What would you like to learn about? Let's co-construct this syllabus. It's a very powerful thing to do with your students. They can write the attendance policy. This is a simple one. Ask your students to write the attendance policy. They usually make it more strict than you. They're like, wow, you're going to get minus 10 points if you don't show up. I'm like, wow, that's more strict than I would. It's like, I've had individual students each write their own attendance policy. And they actually follow it if they write it. Like, and the other thing is, like, if your students don't want to come to class, like, ask why. What is it? Why does this class not seem of value to you? Or maybe you have other things going on in your life. But just stop policing attendance and start thinking about what will make a student want to show up in my class. Creating learning outcomes. Students can write the learning outcomes along with the syllabus. What do we want to learn this semester? I had a colleague that had his students write the learning outcomes after the semester was over. What did you actually learn? And see if that matched with what his ideas of what those learning outcomes were supposed to be. It's a really powerful exercise. They can determine what goes on during class. You could start class this day. What do you guys want to do today? You want me to lecture? Want to do a lab? Want to do... A lot of times, I just want to sit and do notes. Designing the assignments themselves. I used to use an Excel spreadsheet and create an assignment database. And I put some assignments that I created. But I said, you guys create some assignments too. And then students could choose to do my assignments. They can choose to do their own assignment. They can choose to do somebody else's assignment. And they wanted the other students in the class to choose their assignments. So they would make them really good. And they'd get competitive with, like, let's make some really good assignments. So again, this is freedom and flexibility. Gives them more sense of control and what they want to learn and what they want to be doing. And they really get into assignment design. And obviously, you can help them through it. Decide what they want to make public or openly licensed or not. Okay, because forcing a student to put an open license and sharing something is not open education. That's exploitation, right? Give them the decision around what they want to openly license, but explaining what it is. Explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. One of the mistakes I made early on when I first started teaching more with an open pedagogy approach was to not explain to my students what I was doing and why I was doing it. And then they were like, oh, okay. Now, like, and don't just do it on the first day of class, because people forget. Like, every day remind them of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And along with this, like, students can determine how they will be graded. We could spend the whole workshop on ungrading. I encourage you to read the ungrading literature, alternative grading workshops. The RIOS Institute that I work with, we run alternative grading workshops. Grading, taking away grades or lessening the power of those grades is a game changer. It turns everything around. How many people, like, grading papers is the worst part of your job? Like, you hate grading. Yeah, exactly. Like, just stop doing it. It's madness. Students don't like it. We don't like it. It doesn't actually promote learning. I know we're stuck with it. I know we're in institutions where you have to give a grade at the end of the semester, but there's ways that we work around that. I've used a lot of self-assessments with my students, and I can talk more about that. But along with what they can do, we also have to support them, what their needs are, right? We have to be able to make sure that they make connections within and beyond the course. They need to develop connections with each other and peers and outside of that work. They need to be able to have flexibility as the default, not the exception. Let me come and ask for an extension. Let me see if you maybe, like, can I do this project instead of that one? And finally, like, we can't forget basic needs support. So many of our students, as you know, are homeless and food insecure. There are studies that show up to 40 to 60% of students can be food insecure, and somewhere around 30 to 40, especially in public institutions. This is huge. Your student that's falling asleep in class may not have had anywhere to sleep last night. Like, just start with curiosity instead of judgment and figure out what's going on for them. So this idea of open pedagogy, of open science, then, is about teaching students the values along with the practices of opening up scientific work. Why are we doing this? Who is this for? This is a website from my animal behavior class where we had our students doing individual projects. They each had their own domain spaces. They each put their own open science student notebook on that page. They shared their proposal, they shared their data, they shared their process. So it wasn't about, you're gonna copy from me. Nobody's copying, we're all sharing, it's all together. And we're not worried about grades, we're collaborating. And we're teaching that value and spirit of collaboration. I mean, nobody's generating any kind of Nobel Prize data here, but they're learning these practices. And so this is where I love to be able to present this to scientists that understand what I'm talking about, like the energy flow and nutrient cycling in the open ecosystem. The idea that open pedagogy is a central part of these connections with open data, OER, open science, open source, open access. These are all interlinked. Right? And so we can't just do open data in a vacuum and call it open science, by the way. So how open pedagogy could impact open science education? Well, you can design assignments that allow students to address those inequities that I talked about. Like, what are the inequities? How might we work towards figuring this out? You know, it's kind of like saying, you know, we're going to solve climate change this semester. You know, nobody's actually going to solve climate change as an individual, but like starting to work towards that, get some thinking in that direction and get some motivated for the kind of work they want to do in the future and who they're going to work with in the future to do it. So addressing inequities is one of them. Grapple with the complexities of data sharing, you know, data privacy, rights, sovereignty, not just the technicalities of it, but to think about what is data sharing about. Working to amplify voices of marginalized groups, like make that an assignment. They'll be like, huh, how do we do that? What does that mean? Who do we identify? And I know it's a difficult context right now. And I'm also optimistic that this context won't be here forever, and that where social change happens, I really think higher education is the ground zero for cultural shifts. You know, if those of us in higher education are not doing the work to change the way that things are, who is? Is it going to be the corporations? Is it going to be policymakers? It's going to be educators, and because we have the influence of those future generations of people that are going to make these kinds of decisions. Bringing a value-focused lens to science, as I've mentioned, that's what open pedagogy brings to open science education. It helps students consider deeply the global impacts of science. What is the science that you're doing? Who's it going to benefit? How is that going to be a problem for some people? To just get them to think about it, right? That's like, even in a non-major science class, let's just think about this for 5 minutes, can be really powerful. This was a quote from one of my students in the marine biology class, and he wrote, "This method of learning, although unconventional, allowed everyone within the class to create really good relationships. I think part of this stems from the fact that there's no underlying competition to be the best in the class or the smartest. It really emphasized that we weren't trying to be competitive. You know, and he says, I feel like this is something that can help me in the future, having myself and my peers remember the good relationships formed within these classes. And I feel like if this young man learned nothing other than this, I feel like it was a successful semester." So, and this is the kind of thing that taking grades and competition away builds and can have really strong impacts on the future. Way more than those top level students that have learned how to do acing all your exams. I'm going to talk about AI for a minute. I know we haven't talked that much about AI at this conference. It's one of these things you're like, I don't want to talk about AI, I don't want to teach about AI, I don't want to use AI. And this is my famous quote, like, Your students are going to be using AI with or without you. I used to say this about Wikipedia. People like, just don't use Wikipedia back in the old days. Just don't go on the internet. It really worked for drugs and sex. Just say no. Like, really, we want a Nancy Reagan approach to AI? Like, that's going to work. Okay, so they're going to use it anyway. Your students with more resources are going to have access to subscriptions to AI. The other ones don't. So we need to think about this. I don't have all the answers to this, but we need to think about what our students are doing. But I think all roads lead back to their motivation for learning. Are they just trying to get a grade? Students, you probably read the articles. The student that didn't use AI was worried that if I don't use it, all my peers in my class are going to do better than me. They're going to get an A and I'm going to be behind. So I got to use it. But we're setting them up with our grading system. So if we set them up with a motivation to learn, can AI actually help them get towards these other things that we're talking about? Maybe, maybe not. But the other thing is, and I want to talk about critical AI literacy, and then I'm going to make my other point. Like Anna Mills, who's done a lot of really cool work, she's a writing teacher. She's not a science educator, but she talks a lot about critical AI literacy. And we have to kind of keep ourselves informed about this. The RIOS Institute's going to run more of an AI learning community. And by the way, everything at RIOS is free and open. But it includes things like understanding, data sets, functions, hallucinations for sure, but also prompts and application, and also the ethics around it, privacy, data rights, automation bias, environmental footprint, exploitation. All of this is part of an understanding of critical AI literacy. And unfortunately, it's all fallen into our laps to teach as well. But there's lots of good resources out there. And I think that I'm just going to mention that the Creative Commons people have had some really good things to say about AI. And if you want to put an open license on something, I'm going through this quick, but you will have the slides. If you create work with generative AI, you can still apply a CC license to it. In the CC license you choose will apply to the creative work that you contribute to the final product, even if the portion produced by the generative AI may itself be uncopyrightable. This is a work in progress. They're still working on this. Okay. But for now, I really want us to think about AI, because our students are not just using AI, they're creating it. It's kind of like we used to say, your students aren't just going on the web, they're constructing it. They're constructing it every time they post something, every time they use something, and students are creating AI tools. They're not just using it, and they're gonna do this with or without us. They need us to drive them, to help them facilitate this, to make this in an ethical context, to direct it towards the kinds of education that we want them to be able to have. Here's an example of undergraduates that won this Europe's hackathon, right? They created a AI tool called Insight that visually maps how academic papers cite and build upon one another. Okay, so students can create AI. What are they creating? Why are they creating it? Can they create AI tools that do good instead of evil, right? This is where I'm driving at this when they are doing this into the future. And I want to remind us, and this is a quote by David Brooks, who says, the most important thing about AI may be that it shows us what it can't do, and so it reveals who we are and what we have to offer. And this is something to remind our students as well. Like, what are the things that AI can't do? And some people say, well, it can do everything. It can be compassionate. Like, it can feign compassion, right? But can it really be compassionate? And so we can talk with our students about that. And with open pedagogy, we can teach our students to do the things that AI can't do. Like, discover their motivation to learn and contribute. Why do you want to create that? What are you contributing it for? What is your motivation to learn? If it's just a grade, you're lost. So just don't be afraid to take grading away. Don't be afraid to push the edges at your institution around this, because you want to motivate your learners in every possible way that you can. And people all over the country are doing ungrading. There are resources for you. Instill a joy of writing. Like, I'll just get AI to write it for me. Well, that's no fun, right? Like, why is it joyful to write? Where are you thinking inside your own head? And getting your students to be inspired to do this, to develop their own distinct personal voice. You know, I've had, and I may have the slide up here, students writing things and then AI writing it for them, and they're like, that's bland, that's stupid, it's not even funny. I don't want, that's not what I sound like. I have something to say, and I want others to hear what it is. I'm not going to just use AI to say it because it doesn't say what I want to say. So helping them to discover what they want to say, discover what they want to learn, discover who they want to become, right? That's what we do as educators, far more than we just teach content. Cultivate their creativity. Spark ways for them to be unpredictable. Like AI models are all based on predicting what's the next thing that it's going to say. How do we help our students be unpredictable? This is everything. Finding empathy with others. I firmly believe things like empathy and compassion are teachable skills. It's not this, oh, you're born with it or you're not, right? I teach a lot about nature nurture, and maybe you all do too. It's like nobody's just automatically compassionate or empathetic. You can teach students empathy. Thinking critically, obviously. Addressing systemic inequities. You know, these are a lot of things that we can work with our students to do. This was the example about, I think this was a bunch of high school students that asked ChatGPT to write something, and it edited out all their jokes, so they put them back. You know, a real example of how you can work in juxtaposition with AI. And having students do things like have AI generate content that gets summarized. They can learn to confront that information. They can push back on it. They can see what AI spits out and develop their own ideas. And they can do this even in complicated scientific contexts because they're reading the literature too. It motivates students to build future AI tools that support a socially just and sustainable world. I want to just take a minute to advertise and highlight this AI tool that was developed by Mike Caulfield at the University of Washington, who is like one of the world's experts on fact checking. He had all kinds of strategies. He's written books around fake news and how to get your students to understand what's not true and how do you go on the internet. And he recently, just like in the last week, constructed this GPT tool. And in the document that I'm going to give you, it's got a link to this tool where you can type something in like playing chess improves academic performance in other subjects. Is that true? Like put in anything in there. The recent Minnesota political assassination was a radical liberal plot. You can type in anything and it will give you a long output of different sources and facts and really does a wonderful job of fact checking. So I'm going to end with this quote by data scientists from MIT that wrote a book called Teach Data Like an Intersectional Feminist. And Catherine D'Ignazio and Laura Klein wrote, what if we imagine teaching data as a place to start creating the connected, collective, caring world that we want to see? And how many people who've read this or seen this book? It's a great source. I have a link to it in the document too, I hope. Really. These students were out there asking the question using statistical methods like, is the lottery good or bad for your neighborhood? Right? Like how much is loaded in that question? And how much data analysis are you doing to answer it? And what does the answer tell us? Okay, so workshop part here. You can either scan the QR code or just type in bit.ly/AlanOP25. Hopefully y'all brought some laptops because it might be hard to read. This is going to take you to a document that I'm also going to put up on the screen once I give you a chance to open it. And I want you to spend time thinking creatively about these kinds of assignments that we can create. So let me know if it's okay for me to stop sharing this for a minute. Yeah.
Time for questions.
Oh, yeah, sure. We can do questions too. I'm sorry. Please.
I was curious, you know, I really love a lot of these approaches. They seem to really like, as someone who was recently a student, I really like the notion of promoting learning above everything, teaching people how to be lifelong learners. And I really like a lot of these approaches. I wonder if you struggled when doing this. How do you deal with the effects on how do you retain a certain reputation amongst your peers who are doing the standard, whatever thing at the same time? How do you demonstrate that what you're doing has this same and even way more value in some cases than their standard approach?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and every institutional context is different. The answer to that question may be different for different people in different contexts. And one of the things you can do is point to a community of people that are doing it successfully. And the other thing you can do is just say, look at the students themselves, what they're saying about what they're learning, and the fact that they feel like they're getting so much more out of this. Administrators like to see students that seem happy, at least, right? And colleagues will be like, they're not learning enough biology. But in fact, you can demonstrate that they are by the products that they're producing to a certain extent. Some people are in positions where they have more flexibility than others. Like, I teach an introductory anatomy and physiology class. How am I going to do this? Well, people do it, actually. You can build it, you can scaffold it, you can bring pieces in. Convincing your peers, that's an old-time, long-time faculty development quagmire. And I used to run the Faculty Development Center at Keene State. And a lot of it is about building community with your peers. Like, let's get together and talk about it. Let's have an open pedagogy faculty learning community to just read some literature and see what people have done. And I always start with a question like, what are your biggest complaints about what's happening for you? What are your biggest complaints about your students? What are you unhappy about? What do you want to change? What could you change? What would you change if you could change it? A lot of roads go back to students aren't doing this and they're not doing that and they're complaining. And so we talk about like, well, what is it that's going to actually solve that problem? So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you've shared so many resources on this.
Okay, yeah.
So much.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, so I always think about assessments and we know what our students are getting from open pedagogy.
Yeah.
And are there any that you've included here that?
Well, I don't use rubrics and assessment tools. I feel like there are ways in which having, in spite, and maybe this sounds like heresy, but in spite of this canonical thinking of if you don't have a long list of specified assessment objectives and rubrics that students are going to follow, then they're not going to learn anything. It goes back to motivation. Like, why are they there? Why are they paying tuition? Are they just trying to get out? And are we going to generate people that are going to just become doctors and kill people because they haven't learned anything? Like, I just don't think that's true. I feel like the self-assessments are what I've primarily used with my students. I used to have them fill out self-assessment forms like 4 times in the semester and ask them questions like, how would you describe the development of your research project? What have you done in this thing so far? We'd have this back and forth conversation and they'd give themselves a grade. And I've told this story before. They'd say, I haven't done anything yet. I give myself a C. I'll be like, how come that's not an F? You actually haven't done it. And so we talk about what does it mean? They're terrified of a C. They're terrified. So when we take that tyranny of grades away and assessing what they're doing and making sure they're fitting this rubric, if they're creating the learning outcomes and learning things, it's a broad openness that I use self-assessment. And publicly, we would run student panels, the champions of students that were authoring things or speaking for themselves about what they were doing. It's messier and it's also more powerful. But yeah, I don't have a assessment document for you. Not
assessment just for grades, but kind of beyond, like longer term. Is there? But we can talk.
People have definitely written papers comparing students in open pedagogy classes to non and that kind of thing. So it's a little trickier. There's more OER comparisons than open pedagogy comparisons. But yeah.
So I love a self-assessment for formative assessment.
Okay.
And I've also found and seen in the literature that there's a lot of bias in the students about who is going to give themselves different grades.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering, in a practical way, how do you deal with that?
One of your jobs as professor is to identify that. You know your students so well. Your women students are going to grade themselves lower. Your white male students are going to grade themselves higher. You're aware of that. When you have the conversation, you're saying, what have you done? What are you producing? Why have you done this? Like, why do you think you should have an A here? And then you kind of move it around so that I think I grade effort more than anything. Like they're really motivated by it. They're putting a lot of time and effort and thought, and they're trying, and they're really moving that way. So I've definitely raised grades of some students as well as lowered some of others. And yeah, if all your students end up with an A and a B, the world isn't going to die, right? If higher education can continue to be defunded to zero, the world will die, right? Like, so we have to put into perspective what we're doing here for sure. Yeah.
I've seen some work on rubrics, particularly in like college biology students, that rubrics and the presence of rubrics and understanding the expectations will lower students' anxiety across the board. And I'm curious, like how do you think balancing all of the benefits that come from open pedagogy with like the very traditional rubric method when there are benefits to those rubrics as much as there are like.
But those rubric benefits map to grades. I want to know what you're expecting of me. What do you want from me? What do you want me to do? I don't understand what you want me to do, because if I do it wrong, I'm going to get a D. So I'm not saying that we don't give them any kind of sets of guidelines to work from. But to say, like, if you do this particular thing and that particular is going to be 5 points, and if you do this thing, it's only going to be 4 points, I think that's detrimental. So when you're tying a rubric outcome to a particular thing they accomplish to get a grade at the end, they're playing the game of school. And I have a colleague that wrote a really good paper called The Game of School. And some students are really good at playing the game of school. And others are really good at learning, and they don't necessarily get good grades. And I'm trying to decouple that gaming school mentality. And I think rubrics set up the game for students. So yeah, put your rubrics out there, but just detach any grading from it and see what happens then. Yeah.
Not as much of a question, but just an observation. Because I'm in the middle of launching our undergraduate internship program, right? This open pedagogy parallels a lot of what I think of as an internship.
Okay.
At least how I set up a program, and thinking about the grading. One of the things you set up, we have all of our mentors completed a form where they say, what does it look like to be successful at the end of an internship? We're not giving a grade. It's not our job to give them an A or anything. Yeah. But what does it mean to have a successful internship? What does it mean to have a successful first week as an intern?
Yeah.
And that alleviates for students who are coming into a space that's totally different than school, but is very much about learning. Alleviate some of that anxiety immediately. I mean, there's a lot of parallels to what we're thinking. Like students are, working collaboratively. They're doing, they're collecting. There's not a grade, so there's not a competitiveness.
So
there's a lot of things along there that are really parallel. Like
exactly,
really, you're doing this way. You're really preparing them to.
So why are we doing all the good stuff outside of our classrooms?
Right.
There's many stories of like that. The co-curricular, extracurricular, after the fact, as an extra side project. Like that, my argument is that that's exactly what we should be doing.
Yeah,
in our classroom.
That's what I'm saying. Like it's very parallel as a work environment as opposed to a.
Yeah.
In some ways.
I mean, I wouldn't call it a work. My goal is not to just have students think about how to be a good worker bee, but yeah.
Right, but the expectations are you're never going to get a grade as an employee. You're going to get
and yet grades never stop, right? How many employees want you to fill out the stars at the end of the thing? And like a job interview is a grade. Like we are, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying we are obsessed as a society with grading and sorting and figuring out who is better than who. And ultimately, people have written about this sorting, and people feeling like they're not good enough is what has been pushed back against higher ed, has created a lot of political polarization and led to political instability in our country. And we contribute to it with this idea of being obsessed with who is better than who all the time. But yeah, thank you for that. It's a really, really good point.
I should probably let someone go.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, kind of very related to that. How, and it sounds like with self-reflection, that's what you do, but how do you frame kind of like feedback and self-reflection in some context that isn't grading? Because I think that like guidance and even becoming acquainted with the shortcomings of your work is still important. So how do you switch that or like, how do you discuss that when students might have a mindset that does go straight to grades or straight to
and it is hard because they've come out of a culture where they have to get grades, and we've created the system. It's really hard to change. I mean, one of the things I've experimented with, and granted, I was like a tenured full professor, so I could do whatever shit I wanted to do, but but it worked, because when you would say to students, okay, whatever you say here, you can still get an A or a B. You can still get an A, no matter what you've said. It takes that pressure off, where they start being more honest with themselves. Like, actually, I could do this better. And I want to create a piece that other people want to read, or actually, I want to have an impact on my community. I want somebody to read that piece I wrote about spring break and have it make a difference in the mind of a fraternity kid going to the beach. Like, I really want that to happen. And so their self-assessment is about how well they're doing that, because they're motivated to produce and create and learn something. And detaching it from the grade is by making the assessment as detached from it as possible. And the only power that we can have that in our space within our institutions are still sort of forcing grades, is to say, you can get an A as long as you do this or this or this, and lower the stakes for them, and lower the stakes for yourself. I promise you, it'll be so much more fun to come to work every day.
So I guess there's a really interesting, because I'm really on board with this, like I really am. Mm-hmm. And I was tutoring a group of high schoolers, and I spoke to one of my tutors, and she actually really pushed back against the idea of getting rid of standardized testing, which I found really interesting. And she came from a disenfranchised community generally, and she had parents that were working 2 jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked her, well, why would you want standardized tests that benefit that? Well, she said, look at the rest of college applications. What else benefits you on a college application? Right. It's the extracurriculars that I couldn't do because my parents couldn't take me anywhere. It's the the reputation of my school that was lower. The only thing that gave me reputation was a standardized test. It's actually my only opportunity to get a possibility to go to a better school. And so that's that contrast is really stark to me, and I couldn't really figure out how do we get rid of it.
Well, it's sad that we live in such a dysfunctional system, right? Like there's layers of inequity there. That student not having access, that standardized tests are your only option. Yeah. It's like it's a terrible Sophie's choice to have to make, right, for a student. Like, what, you don't have any other options. And so I don't have an easy answer for that, other than let's create the students that are going to change the world, that are going to change the systemic structures. And it's not going to be all the students all at once, but to try to motivate those students that get out there to make the changes that are necessary to remove a system that doesn't give certain people access to economic resources. Yeah. This is the social inequity piece that I was talking about, and the sort of neoliberal domination of science education and education in general. And yeah, if I had an answer to fix that, maybe I'd run for a political office or something, but it's a good question. And sometimes you have to say, okay, for you should do that. Like, this is what we're stuck with right now. Yeah.
I think that's where people have the power, the faculty have to, it's our responsibility. You can't put that on that student. The student's trying to navigate the system. They're not in a position to change, but they see alternatives, and you give them just that eye-opening thing, but that's sort of the hard thing they have to adjust to. They're trying to play in a system they haven't been able to play in and change at the same time. It's really asking a lot.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. It's true. And we are all in different places. We all have different levels, different status, different institutions that we work in. If you're in a community college, if you're a part-time person, if you're a fully tenured full professor, if you're in an R1, like we all come in different contexts, and you have to think about what is your sphere of influence. What is my sphere of influence right now? What can I do? Can I at least get together with some colleagues to talk about this? Can I at least get together with colleagues, maybe at other institutions via Zoom links, which is what we do with the RIOS communities, try to bring science educators from around the country together to have conversations about things, that we build things together. So I want to talk about the document a little bit, but I'm happy to answer more questions too. Let's let's see, oh, that's our ORCA grant. We're funded to have people engaged to help build open science curricula that kind of builds out these values that I'm talking about. And we do have a little bit of funding for people to participate. It's in the document too. If you missed this QR code, let me see. Okay, how do we do this? I'm just going to share the document that you have hopefully open in front of you if you do have your laptop with you or trying to read it on a phone. So first of all, you'll see there's a link to my slides at the very top. So you can open up those slides and they're right there for you. Let me know if that isn't working for some reason. And then along the side, so I'm going to come back to this open pedagogy assignments thing because that's what I want you to spend the rest of the time thinking about today, if you will. This footer in the document, if you're interested in receiving information about the ORCA project, you can fill out the Google form literally says, yeah, I want some more information. It doesn't commit you to anything. There's open pedagogy resources. They're very broad. They're not science specific. They're like, what an open pedagogy class taught me about myself was one of my student authors who wrote this a number of years ago. And then there's other portals and things, guide to making OER text. There's a lot of stuff here. You could spend the rest of the time clicking through links and reading stuff, how to author OER, how to annotate the web with hypothesis, how to teach with Wikipedia, like if any of those pieces particularly grabbed you. Students creating their own openly licensed domain spaces or websites, obviously WordPress.com or Google sites. Well, sometimes you have institutions that will give a website to every student, and we had that for a while, and then the institution can stop supporting it, it goes away. So even though WordPress.com can have ads on it sometimes, usually there's not too many ads, and then if you pay $30 a year, they go away. So you can give your students that choice. They can start playing with that to see if they want to do something later. So these are three examples of student sites that have been around for a number of years now. And then this is just that trust, power, and agency. Like you could spend your time thinking about how would you incorporate some of these pieces into your teaching. So I'm trying to run this workshop very open pedagogically, which is to give you choices about what you want to work on, what you want to do, including leave, including check your email, but I'm hoping you'll choose to do some of this stuff. These are critical AI literacy and intersections with open resources that are out there. Some of them are more general about AI. There's some really good ones. There is Audrey Waters, who writes The Second Breakfast. Most superb critique. Like she's just like, AI is going to destroy the world. Like if you want to not sleep at night, read Audrey Waters. She's really brilliant. Maybe you don't want to do that. And then at the very end, I have some citations. Oh, actually, Found and Share OER, just like repositories for finding open resources. People are like, how do you find stuff? Even if you're not in a community college, you can join the CCC OER community email group. Every day somebody's saying, can somebody point me to an OER resource about this? And there's always somebody out there that knows where it is. You know, if you can't find what you want, get on that list and ask people. You will find somebody that will answer you, and you do not have to be a community college person to do it. You can join the RIOS Institute. If you click on that link, it'll tell you more about what we're about. It's completely free, it's open. You just have to create a login. We never ask anybody for money at any time. We just want people to participate to do this kind of work. There's the fact-checking tool by Mike Caulfield that I mentioned. There's a link to it right there. And then there's just some good science citations around open science and teaching. So what we're trying to do with the ORCA project is to bring people in to develop resources so that we can develop something like an open science minor that's going to be about the broader things that I'm talking about, not just like using open data tools, but like that's part of it, right? But a core curriculum that gets at addressing inequities and these kinds of things. And so to go back to the top of that document then, working, and so if you want to think about like what kind of an assignment might you develop, and this could go into a course, or maybe you want to develop a whole course. You could outline a course in your mind right now. or maybe just an assignment. But say, for example, what would actually teach true collaboration? And I don't mean teamwork, an obsession with which student in the group did more than the other. You know, like I did all the work and they're getting the same grade as me. How do we get rid of that mentality? How do we treat actually what does it mean to grade the collaborative effort instead of a product or individuals, like the obsession with individuals being better than others? How, like, I'd love to see creative ideas for how we do that. I don't have the answer for that. I want y'all brilliant people to come up with that. Assignment where, you know, take a look at the concerns. That's that list of inequities in open science. You know, have students address a structural inequity issue as an assignment along with your open science class. Students can create openly licensed tools, guidebooks, curated resources that help promote and facilitate sharing. You know, they could be posted on the Cubes Hub or other publicly available repository. Have students explore the question, what exactly is open science? You know, I see a lot of folks here using open data and open science interchangeably here. What is it? How is it so much broader than open data or even open access publishing? And consider the work that's happening in other parts of the world, things that are happening in Europe and in South Africa. Some of those images I showed came from South Africa. Create an openly licensed, you can have your students create an openly licensed website that describes their findings and compares open science to not open science. And again, the extent to which it's being done. I think that's my number 6, like have students do some research about the benefits of open science and say, okay, somebody listed this as a benefit on a really pretty slide with lots of colors, but is it really happening? How much is it happening? Who's doing it? Where's that benefit being felt? And again, if it's so great, why is it not being adopted? And having students interview individual scientists and try to start to uncover things that help to cause a cultural shift. And if everybody's class had students doing this, and you know, building a cultural shift is not something that happens overnight. This is about the decolonizing science ed movement. So a lot of choices for you to explore within this document, to think about developing an outline for an assignment or a course, work with colleagues, get together at a table that people want to work together and talk about it, or to do any of the other chunks that are on here and just explore some tools or resources or any other questions. Or I'm gonna mill around and see how people are feeling. Yeah.
The last thing that was on my mind is, I don't know the size of your classes, but how do you do this at scale? Especially you do DIY kind of thing. If you're one professor, how do you facilitate so many people doing that? Different
folks have done it. I mean, I have to say I've done it a lot in smaller classes, but Melanie Linehan, who's in Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey, you know, had like a intro bio course of 100 students, and she had them all building their own individual websites, curating that in a main page, having students write work and making comments and talking to each other. So there are some things that you can do with larger classes. Yeah, not
trade-offs.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs, right? There's no easy answers, and a lot of them like you figure it out.
Oh, I was just gonna say and comment to that. I mean, once you start doing the classes, you can have students come back and be like undergrad or TAs for the classes. That's one of the things
that's great.
Trying to be more conscious of is.
I love that.
Yeah. So you can build that community and.
Cool. That's a great idea. It's a really great idea. I think having students do student panels that have been on this, talking to other students. Students will hear something from another student that they will never hear from you. They'll say the same, you said the same thing. You're like, I just said that last week, but no, my peer said it. Now that actually, it must be true. So, okay. All right, well, thanks. And I'm just wander around. I hope you'll work on some of this stuff. I'm gonna turn the mic off.